The scorching August sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town of Redemption Falls as the entire population gathered around the weathered wooden platform that served as both stage and auction block. The heat shimmered off the parched earth like ghostly dancers, and the air was thick with tension that had nothing to do with the oppressive temperature. Standing at the front of the crowd, Jonas Mackenzie shifted his weight from one worn boot to the other, his calloused hands gripping the brim of his faded hat. The auctioneer, a portly man with a voice like gravel, raised his gavel high above his head and surveyed the sea of faces before him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he bellowed, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "we have here today a most unusual property. The Broken Arrow Ranch, consisting of 160 acres of prime grazing land, a 2-story farmhouse, a barn, stables, and a well that's never run dry. Starting bid is 25 cents. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. 25 cents for land that should have been worth thousands. Jonas felt his heart skip a beat. He'd been working other men's ranches for 15 years, saving every penny he could scrape together, dreaming of the day he could own his own piece of the frontier. But there was something wrong here. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The wealthy ranchers and merchants who usually dominated these auctions stood frozen, their faces pale as winter snow. Their eyes darted nervously between each other, but not one raised a hand. The silence stretched on like a taut rope ready to snap. "Do I hear 25 cents? The auctioneer repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Jonas looked around at the familiar faces, men he'd worked alongside, merchants who'd sold him supplies, women who'd served him meals at the local boarding house. Every single one of them was staring at him with a mixture of pity and terror, as if he were walking willingly toward his own grave. But Jonas Mackenzie had nothing left to lose. His last job had ended when the ranch owner decided to sell to a larger operation. His savings amounted to $3.47, a fortune by his standards, but barely enough to survive another month. This might be his only chance. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his weathered hand. 25 cents, he called out, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. The crowd turned as one to stare at him. In their eyes, he saw not envy or competition, but something far worse, the look people give a condemned man walking to the gallows. "Do I hear 30 cents? The auctioneer asked, but his question was met with absolute silence. The gavel came down with a sound like a coffin lid closing. "Sold to Jonas Mackenzie for 25 cents. As Jonas made his way through the crowd to pay his quarter and collect the deed, hands reached out to pat his shoulder, not in congratulation, but in farewell. Old Martha Stevens, who ran the general store, pressed a small bag of supplies into his hands. "God be with you, Jonas," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. The ride out to the Broken Arrow Ranch took Jonas through some of the most beautiful country he'd ever seen. Rolling hills covered in tall grass stretched as far as the eye could see, broken by groves of oak and cottonwood trees. A clear stream wound its way through the property, and in the distance, he could see cattle, dozens of them, grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. It was perfect. Too perfect. As he crested the final hill, the ranch house came into view. It was larger than he'd expected, built from solid timber with a wraparound porch and shuttered windows. The barn was enormous, easily capable of housing 50 head of cattle through the worst winter storms. Everything looked to be in excellent condition. And that's when Jonas saw her. Hanging from the massive oak tree that shaded the front of the house was a woman. But not just any woman. She was the most striking person Jonas had ever laid eyes on. Tall as many men, with the bronze skin and proud features of the Lakota people, she hung suspended by a rope around her wrists, her feet barely touching the ground. Her long black hair hung like a curtain around her face, and her clothes were torn and bloodied. But she was alive. Her chest rose and fell with labored breathing, and as Jonas approached, her dark eyes opened and fixed on his with an intensity that nearly knocked him from his saddle. Jonas dismounted quickly, his hands shaking as he drew his knife. "Easy there, miss," he said softly, approaching slowly so as not to startle her. "I'm going to get you down from there." The woman tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged from her parched throat. Jonas could see the rope burns on her wrists, the bruises on her arms, and the defiance that still burned in her eyes despite her ordeal. "Hang on," he murmured, reaching up to cut the ropes. "I've got you." As the bonds fell away, she collapsed forward, and Jonas caught her, staggering under her considerable weight. She was not just tall but powerfully built, with the kind of strength that came from a lifetime of hard living on the frontier. He helped her to the porch steps, then fetched water from his canteen. "Drink slowly," he advised, holding the canteen to her lips. She drank gratefully, then pushed the canteen away and looked up at him. When she spoke, her English was clear but heavily accented. "You should not have bought this place," she said. "You will die here just like the others." "Others?" Jonas asked, settling beside her on the steps. She nodded slowly. "My name is Ayana. I am daughter of Chief Running Bear of the Lakota. This land..." She gestured weakly toward the rolling hills. "This was our winter camp for generations. The white man who lived here before, Thomas Whitmore, he found something. Something that powerful men wanted buried forever." "What kind of something?" Ayana's eyes hardened. "Papers. Documents that prove this land was never legally sold. That the treaties were forged, the signatures faked. Whitmore was going to take them to the territorial government. They killed him for it." Jonas felt a chill run down his spine despite the heat. "Where are these papers now?" "Hidden somewhere in the house. That's why they kept me alive. They thought I knew where. But Whitmore never told me. He only said that if anything happened to him, justice would find a way." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the hills. Jonas stood, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. A group of riders was approaching fast, at least a dozen men with the hard look of professional gunfighters. At their head rode a man Jonas recognized from town, Samuel Crenshaw, who owned the largest ranch in the territory and sat on the town council. Behind him came men Jonas didn't know, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats, their hands resting casually on their weapons. "Mackenzie!" Crenshaw called out as the group reined in before the house. "Heard you made quite a purchase today." "Bought it fair and square," Jonas replied, his voice steady. Crenshaw laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Fair and square. That's rich. You have any idea what you've gotten yourself into, boy? Enlighten me." "This land has been nothing but trouble. The previous owner, Whitmore, he was a troublemaker. Stirred up all kinds of problems with the Indians, spread lies about legitimate business deals. Made enemies of important people." Jonas glanced down at Ayana, who was watching the exchange with growing anger. "Seems to me the only problem here is men who think they can take whatever they want." Crenshaw's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, Mackenzie. A fatal one. This land isn't for sale, and it never was. There are complications. Legal issues that need to be resolved." "I've got the deed right here," Jonas said, patting his shirt pocket. "Signed, sealed, and witnessed." "Deeds can be revoked," one of the other riders spoke up. This man was younger than Crenshaw, with cold blue eyes and the kind of smile that never reached them. "I'm Deputy Marshal Harrison. There's been some irregularities discovered in the land records. I'm afraid you'll need to vacate the property until matters can be sorted out." "And how long might that take?" Jonas asked. Harrison shrugged. "Could be months. Could be years. These legal matters are complicated." Jonas looked at the men arrayed before him. Everyone was armed, everyone had the look of a killer. But something in Ayana's eyes, some spark of hope that hadn't been extinguished despite her ordeal, made him straighten his shoulders and plant his feet firmly. "I appreciate your concern, gentlemen," he said formally, "but I'll be staying. This is my land now, bought and paid for according to the law." The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. Hands moved closer to gun handles. Horses shifted restlessly, sensing their riders' tension. "Mackenzie," Crenshaw said, his voice soft and dangerous, "you're a decent man. Hard worker, honest as they come. Don't throw your life away over a piece of dirt that's brought nothing but misery to everyone who's tried to claim it. Maybe it just needed the right owner." Crenshaw studied him for a long moment, then nodded to his men. "We'll be back tomorrow to discuss this further. I hope you'll have come to your senses by then." As the riders wheeled their horses and galloped away, Jonas felt his knees go weak. He just signed his own death warrant, and they both knew it. "You are either very brave or very stupid," Ayana said from the porch steps. "Probably both," Jonas admitted. "But I've spent my whole life working other people's land, taking orders from other people, living by other people's rules. This is mine now. I'm not giving it up without a fight." Ayana struggled to her feet, still weak from her ordeal but determined. "Then we fight together. My people have been fighting for this land for generations. I will not let it fall into the hands of thieves and murderers." That first night, Jonas barely slept. Every sound, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through the grass, the distant howl of a coyote, had him reaching for his gun. Ayana had collapsed from exhaustion shortly after sunset, but even in sleep, she seemed alert and ready for danger. As dawn broke over the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jonas stood on the porch and surveyed his new domain. It really was beautiful land, rich soil, good water, natural shelter for livestock. It could support a family for generations if worked properly. But first, he had to live long enough to work it. The sound of a single horse approaching made him tense, but the rider who emerged from the morning mist was not one of Crenshaw's men. It was an old Native American woman, her long gray hair braided with feathers and beads, her weathered face marked by decades of hardship and wisdom. She reined in before the porch and looked up at Jonas with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "You are the one who cut down my granddaughter," she said in perfect English. Jonas nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I am Winona, medicine woman of the Lakota. I have come to tend to Ayana's wounds and to warn you of what is coming." As if summoned by her grandmother's voice, Ayana appeared in the doorway, still weak but standing proud and tall. "Grandmother," she said in their native tongue, then switched to English. "I told him about Whitmore, about the papers." Winona dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd been riding horses longer than most people had been alive. She carried a leather bag filled with herbs and medicines, and her touch was gentle as she examined Ayana's injuries. "The papers," she said as she worked, "Whitmore showed them to my son, Ayana's father, before he died. They prove that the treaty signed 10 years ago was a fake. The Real Treaty gave this land to the Lakota people in perpetuity. But powerful men in the territorial government forged documents to steal it. Why didn't Whitmore go to the authorities?" Jonas asked. Winona's laugh was bitter. The authorities were the ones who forged the papers. The territorial governor, the marshal, the judge, all of them are in Crenshaw's pocket. Whitmore was going to take the evidence to Washington, to the federal government. But they killed him first. They made it look like an Indian attack. Said we massacred him for trespassing on our land. Used it as justification to drive more of our people onto the reservation. Jonas felt the weight of the truth settling on his shoulders like a yoke. He hadn't just bought a ranch, he'd bought himself a war. Where are the papers now? Hidden somewhere in the house. Whitmore was clever. He knew they would come for him eventually. But even under torture, he never revealed the location. The three of them spent the morning searching the house from top to bottom. They looked behind every loose board, under every floorboard, inside every piece of furniture. The house was well built and solid, with plenty of places to hide important documents. It was Ayana who found it. She was examining the massive stone fireplace when she noticed that one of the stones was slightly different from the others, newer, cleaner, as if it had been recently replaced. "Here," she called softly. Working together, they managed to pry the stone loose. Behind it was a metal box, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture. Jonas's hands shook as he opened it. Inside were dozens of documents. The original treaty, signed by President Grant himself, guaranteeing the Lakota permanent ownership of the land. Then there were the forgeries, so expertly done that only a careful examination revealed the differences. But most damning of all were the letters between Crenshaw, the territorial governor, and various other officials, detailing exactly how the land theft was to be carried out and the profits divided. "My God," Jonas whispered, "this would bring down the entire territorial government. Which is why they will kill us all to keep it secret," Winona said grimly. As if her words had been a prophecy, the sound of many horses approaching fast echoed across the hills. But this time it wasn't just Crenshaw and his men, it was an army. Jonas counted at least 30 riders, all armed to the teeth. At their head rode not just Crenshaw but also a man in an expensive suit who could only be the territorial governor himself. Behind them came what looked like a company of territorial militia, officially sanctioned killers with the law on their side. "We're outnumbered 10 to 1, Jonas said, checking his weapons. "Numbers mean nothing when you fight for what is right," Ayanna replied, but even she looked daunted by the force arrayed against them. Winona stood and walked to the center of the room. From her bag, she drew out a small wooden flute and began to play a haunting melody that seemed to echo through the hills themselves. "What is she doing?" Jonas asked. "Calling our warriors home," Ayanna replied with a fierce smile. The riders stopped just out of rifle range and made camp, clearly intending to wait them out. A white flag appeared, and a single rider approached under its protection. It was the man in the expensive suit, Governor Hamilton himself. Jonas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle cradled in his arms but not directly threatening. "Mr. Mackenzie," the governor called out in a cultured Eastern accent, "I believe we have a misunderstanding that can be resolved peacefully." "I'm listening." "You've purchased land that is currently the subject of a complex legal dispute. Through no fault of your own, you've become entangled in matters far beyond your understanding. I'm prepared to offer you $10,000, a fortune for a man of your circumstances, to simply walk away and forget you were ever here." $10,000. It was more money than Jonas would see in 10 lifetimes of ranch work. Enough to buy his own spread somewhere else, somewhere safe. Enough to start over without looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life. "And what about her?" he asked, nodding toward Ayanna. "The Indian woman is a fugitive from justice. She's wanted in connection with several attacks on legitimate settlers. She'll need to come with us to face trial." Jonas didn't need to ask what kind of trial that would be, or what the verdict would be. "I appreciate the offer, Governor," he called back, "but I think I'll stay. This land suits me." The governor's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing the ruthless man beneath. "You're making a grave mistake, Mr. Mackenzie. Literally grave." "Maybe so, but it's my mistake to make." As the governor rode back to his men, Jonas could see them making preparations for an assault. They clearly didn't intend to wait for him to come to his senses. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, a new sound echoed across the hills. It was the thunder of hoofbeats, but not from the direction of town. This was coming from the north, from the Lakota reservation. Over the ridge came a sight that made Jonas's heart leap. At least 50 Native American warriors, their faces painted for war, their weapons gleaming in the dying light. At their head rode a man who could only be Chief Running Bear, Ayanna's father, his long hair streaming behind him like a battle flag. The two forces faced each other across the open ground as darkness fell. Campfires sprang up on both sides, and the night was filled with the sounds of men preparing for battle. "Your father?" Jonas asked Ayanna as they watched the warriors make camp. She nodded, pride and sorrow mixing in her eyes. "He swore he would die before he let white men steal more of our land. Those papers, they prove that everything we've lost was taken through lies and fraud." The night passed slowly. Jonas dozed fitfully, waking at every sound. Beside him, Ayanna kept watch at the window, her keen eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Just before dawn, a commotion from the direction of the militia camp caught their attention. Shouts and curses filled the air, and by the growing light, they could see men running back and forth in apparent panic. "What's happening?" Jonas asked. Ayanna smiled grimly. "My people are very good at moving unseen in the darkness. I believe some of the soldiers are discovering that their horses have wandered away in the night. And perhaps their weapons as well." Indeed, as the sun rose, it became clear that the Lakota warriors had spent the night conducting a masterful campaign of harassment. Horses had been driven off, weapons disappeared, and several sentries had been found unconscious and bound. The militia's overwhelming numerical advantage had been significantly reduced. Governor Hamilton was clearly furious, gesticulating wildly as he berated his officers. Finally, he sent another rider forward under a flag of truce. This time it was Deputy Marshal Harrison who approached the house. "Mackenzie," he called out, "you've got one last chance to end this peacefully. Surrender yourself and the Indian woman, and we'll guarantee safe passage for the rest of her people back to the reservation. And if I don't? Then we'll burn you out and hang what's left from that same tree where we found the squaw." Jonas felt Ayanna stiffen beside him at the slur, but her voice was calm when she spoke. "Tell them," she called out in a voice that carried clearly across the open ground, "tell them that the daughter of Running Bear does not negotiate with thieves and murderers." Harrison's face twisted with rage. "Have it your way, Breed. But don't say we didn't give you a chance." As he rode back to the militia lines, both sides began making final preparations for battle. The Lakota warriors painted their faces and checked their weapons, while the militia loaded rifles and prepared for what they clearly expected to be a massacre. But as the two forces faced each other in the growing daylight, a new element entered the equation. From the direction of town came another group of riders, but these men wore the blue uniforms of the U.S. Army. At their head rode a colonel, his insignia glinting in the morning sun. Behind him came two full companies of cavalry, over 100 men with the authority of the federal government behind them. The colonel rode directly to the center of the open ground between the two forces and raised his hand for attention. "I am Colonel James Morrison of the 7th Cavalry," he announced in a voice trained to carry over the noise of battle. "I am here under direct orders from the War Department to investigate reports of irregularities in territorial land grants and treaty negotiations." Governor Hamilton rode out to meet him, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. "Colonel Morrison, I'm Governor Hamilton. This is a territorial matter, not a federal one. These criminals are in violation of territorial law." "I'm afraid that's where you're wrong, Governor," Morrison replied calmly. "When it involves treaty violations and the illegal seizure of Indian lands, it becomes very much a federal matter." From his saddlebags, Morrison produced an official-looking document. "I have here a warrant for your arrest, Governor Hamilton, as well as warrants for Samuel Crenshaw and several other territorial officials. You're charged with conspiracy, fraud, and violation of federal treaty obligations." The governor's face went white. "This is outrageous. I demand to see your authorization." Morrison smiled coldly. "It seems that someone sent copies of some very interesting documents to Washington. Documents that detail exactly how you and your associates have been stealing Indian land through forged treaties and fraudulent land sales. The president himself signed these warrants." Jonas felt his knees go weak with relief. Somehow word had gotten out. Someone had believed the truth and acted on it. As federal marshals moved to arrest the governor and his co-conspirators, Colonel Morrison rode over to the porch where Jonas and Ayanna stood. "Mr. Mackenzie, I presume?" he said with a slight smile. "I understand we have you to thank for preserving some crucial evidence." "How did you know?" Jonas asked. Morrison's smile widened. "It seems that Thomas Whitmore was more clever than anyone realized. Before he died, he sent copies of all those documents to a friend of his in Washington, a federal judge who'd been suspicious of territorial land deals for some time. When Whitmore was killed, the judge began his own investigation. Your purchase of this land and the subsequent events provided the final proof he needed. What happens now? Now justice is served. The territorial government will be dissolved and replaced with federal administrators until new, honest elections can be held. The fraudulent land sales will be reversed, and the original treaties will be honored. This land belongs to the Lakota people as it always did." Ayanna stepped forward, her head held high. "And Mr. Mackenzie? He bought this land in good faith." Morrison nodded. "That's true. And while the sale itself was based on fraudulent documents, Mr. Mackenzie's actions in protecting Miss Ayanna and preserving the evidence have been instrumental in bringing these criminals to justice. I think some accommodation can be reached." Chief Running Bear, who had been watching the proceedings from across the field, now rode forward. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, his face weathered but dignified, his bearing that of someone accustomed to command. He spoke first in his native language to Ayanna, Who translated. My father says that Jonas Mackenzie is a man of honor who risked his life to save his daughter and protect the truth. He offers him a place among our people and the right to ranch on this land as long as he lives. Jonas felt tears prick his eyes. After a lifetime of wandering, of working other men's land and following other men's orders, he was being offered not just a home, but acceptance into a family. Tell your father, he said to Ayanna, that I'm honored by his offer and accept it gratefully. The crisis was over, but the work was just beginning. In the days that followed, federal investigators swarmed the territory, uncovering a web of corruption that reached into every level of government. Dozens of officials were arrested, millions of acres of stolen land were returned to their rightful owners, and the territorial capital was reorganized from top to bottom. Jonas spent his days helping to repair the damage that had been done to the Lakota people. His knowledge of ranching and farming was invaluable in helping them establish sustainable operations on their restored lands. And gradually, as he worked alongside Ayanna and her people, he found himself becoming part of something larger than himself. The relationship between Jonas and Ayanna grew slowly, built on mutual respect and shared hardship. She was unlike any woman he'd ever known, strong, intelligent, fiercely independent, yet capable of gentleness and compassion when the situation called for it. And he found that his feelings for her went far deeper than simple attraction or gratitude. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the ranch house watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and purple, Ayanna turned to him with a serious expression. "Jonas," she said, "there is something I must tell you. Something about my past that you need to know." Jonas felt his heart skip a beat. "I'm listening." When I was captured by Crenshaw's men, it wasn't by accident. I had been watching Whitmore's house, trying to find the documents myself. My father and I knew they existed, but we didn't know where they were hidden. I was careless and they caught me. You were trying to save your people. There's no shame in that. But there's more. Before the land was stolen, before the treaties were broken, I was promised in marriage to a warrior from another tribe. It was arranged to strengthen alliances between our peoples. When the land was taken and our tribes scattered, the marriage never took place, but technically. Jonas felt his heart sink. "You're still promised to someone else." Ayanna shook her head quickly. "No, that's not what I'm trying to say. The warrior I was promised to died fighting the cavalry 2 years ago. But the point is, I have never been free to make my own choices about marriage. Everything in my life has been decided by duty, by obligation, by the needs of my people. And now," she looked at him with those dark eyes that had haunted his dreams since the first day he'd seen her. "Now I find myself caring for a man who bought a ranch for 25 cents and risked everything to save a stranger's life. A man who could have taken the governor's gold and walked away, but chose to stay and fight for what was right." Jonas reached out and took her hand in his. Her fingers were strong and calloused from hard work, but they fitted perfectly with his own. "Ayanna," he said softly, "I've spent my whole life alone, working other people's land, dreaming of a place to call home. But this ranch, this land, it's not home because I own it. It's home because you're here." She smiled then, the first truly joyful smile he'd seen from her since that first day. "Then perhaps we can build something together. Something that belongs to both of us." Their wedding was celebrated by both the Lakota tribe and the growing number of settlers who had come to respect Jonas's integrity and Ayanna's courage. Federal marshals stood alongside Native American warriors, and the ceremony itself blended traditions from both cultures. Colonel Morrison, who had stayed in the territory to oversee the transition to new government, served as best man, while Chief Running Bear gave his daughter away with obvious pride and affection. But even as they celebrated, Jonas knew that their challenges were far from over. There were still men who resented the return of Native American lands, still politicians who saw the new federal oversight as an obstacle to their ambitions. The peace they had won was fragile and would need to be constantly defended. As if to prove his point, during their first year of marriage, several attempts were made to sabotage their ranch operations. Cattle were driven off, wells were poisoned, and barns were burned in the night. But each time, the combined efforts of the Lakota warriors and the federal marshals tracked down the perpetrators and brought them to justice. Slowly, grudgingly, the territory began to change. New officials, chosen for their honesty rather than their willingness to be bought, began to establish fair and consistent laws. Trade between the Native American tribes and white settlers increased, bringing prosperity to both sides. The artificial divisions that had been created by corrupt politicians began to break down. Jonas and Ayana's ranch became a symbol of this new cooperation. They employed both Native American and white workers, and their annual cattle drives became community events where people from all backgrounds came together to celebrate their shared success. Their first child, a daughter they named Sarah, was born during a blizzard that kept the midwife from reaching the ranch. Jonas found himself delivering his own child with Ayana coaching him through the process, her strength and determination inspiring him even in the midst of labor pains. Sarah was a beautiful child, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She grew up speaking both English and Lakota, equally at home in a saddle or traditional dress, a living bridge between two worlds that were slowly learning to coexist. Their son, Thomas, named for Thomas Whitmore, the man whose courage had made their life together possible, was born 2 years later during a spring storm that seemed to herald new beginnings. He had his father's fair hair but his mother's fierce independence, and from his earliest days, it was clear that he would be a force to be reckoned with. As the years passed, the story of the 25-cent ranch became legend throughout the territory. People would come from hundreds of miles away just to see the place where a simple ranch hand had stood up to corrupt government officials and won. Some came seeking Jonas's advice on their own struggles with injustice, while others simply wanted to meet the man who had proven that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences. But for Jonas, the real victory wasn't in the legend or the fame. It was in the simple daily miracle of waking up next to the woman he loved, on land that truly belonged to both of them, with children who would grow up free from the artificial divisions that had nearly destroyed their parents' generation. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard while the sun set over the hills they now called home, Ayana took Jonas's hand in hers. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Spending that quarter? Everything that came after?" Jonas looked out over the land that had cost him 25 cents and nearly his life. He saw the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, the barn they had rebuilt stronger than before, the school they had helped establish where Native American and white children learned together. Most of all, he saw the family they had built together, not just their own children, but the extended community of friends and neighbors who had become like family, people who had learned to see past the color of skin or the language spoken at home to the character of the person beneath. "Regret it?" he said, lifting their joined hands to his lips to kiss her fingers. "That 25 cents was the best investment I ever made. It bought me everything I never dared dream of having." Ayana smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "And what dreams do you have now?" Jonas was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I dream of watching our children grow up in a world where they don't have to choose between their heritage and their future. I dream of this ranch being passed down through generations who will remember the price that was paid for it and make sure that price was worth paying. And I dream," Ayana added softly, "of a day when no one has to risk everything just to do what's right. When justice isn't something that has to be fought for with guns and blood, but something that exists because good people choose to create it." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jonas reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he had been nobody special, just another drifter looking for work and a place to belong. Now he was a husband, a father, a respected member of a community that was still learning how to exist. The 25 cents he had spent on the Broken Arrow Ranch had indeed bought him much more than land. It had bought him a purpose, a family, and a future worth fighting for. But most importantly, it had taught him that sometimes the most valuable things in life come disguised as the greatest risks. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the sounds of a land at peace, the lowing of cattle, the laughter of children, the quiet conversations of people who had found their place in the world. And in that peaceful evening, Jonas Mackenzie knew that he had indeed found his home. Years would pass, and the story of the 25-cent ranch would be told and retold around campfires and dinner tables throughout the West. Some would embellish it, adding details that never happened or characters who never existed. But at its heart, the story would remain the same, a testament to the truth that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, can choose to do extraordinary things. The ranch still stands today, now run by the descendants of Jonas and Ayanna Mackenzie. The original deed, bought for 25 cents at a rigged auction, hangs framed in the front hall, a reminder that the most important purchases in life are not measured in dollars and cents, but in the courage to stand up for what is right, regardless of the cost. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, visitors to the ranch claim they can still hear the echo of that auctioneer's gavel, the sound that started it all, the sound of justice being bought and paid for, one quarter at a time.